Oh, we are live. Okay. Oh, now the other thing open. Damn it. I'll do it that way. Hello, everyone. It's the 30th of October, this and that. We're going to finish up the text-to-speech section of Karl Marx, Volume 1, Capital, new translation, North and Writer, and this is the preface by North and Paul North, and it shouldn't take too long, so bear with us.
XXXII.
XXII.
Capital doubles, Everts,
Capital doubles, everts, abstracts, reifies, and personifies.
If you learn to think in doubles,
If you learn to think in doubles, in Eversians, in abstractions, to work backward from reifications and personifications to the processes and historical human beings involved in them, you are on your way to understanding the system in which you live. But, you might get the sense from this that capital exists in a set of stationary categories, that there are ways in which it always is. More confounding because, by value in motion, Marx does not mean only that value travels from here to there. It regularly also changes its form. Value moves and transforms, and its change of form is necessary for the system to function. Therefore, a change of thought is necessary to understand it. Learn to think in transformational relays, where what was a commodity is now money and what was money is now a commodity again in Marx's famous formulas, C, M, C and M, C, M. Formulas they may be, but they represent real circuits of transformation. Raw materials metamorphose into finished commodities, and an opposite process gets some attention here too, though more so in Volume 2, where products, especially means of production, slowly wear away or get used up in production and consumption. Wearing out is one type of consumption, another transformation that value undergoes. Neither arbitrary nor sporadic, transformations happen continually that is traded for money, which then travels to production again, back in the hands of the original producer, to become, once again, commodities as raw materials. Metamorphic circuits proceed in cycles, and smaller cycles intersect to make bigger rounds of production, as all circuits reproduce themselves each year. Volume 2 gives all the details about these circuits of transformation. Volume 1 introduces the ultimate motivator for the circuits and their revolving movement. They move, it all moves because capital wants to increase. Because of forces only hinted at in this Volume 1, of the main forces being competition, which is treated more directly in the posthumously constituted Volume 3, but also because of the ongoing and changing needs of any business and economic sector. Capital in total has to continually grow. Each capitalist has an independent drive toward accumulation, and the system as a whole is shaped not like a circle but like a spiral. Around go the circuits in one motion, widening go the circuits in another. This is partly because, the more a capitalist accumulates, the more they are able to accumulate. And so, on one side, the relations among classes, between kinds of actors, owners, producers, merchants, financiers, bankers, transporters, communications workers, and so forth among sectors. Between economic institutions and the state that supports and protects them. All these relations need to be reproduced year after year without major breaks for all the actors to receive their livelihoods and for the businesses to stay in business. Marx asks you on one level to think in cycles that over time serve reproduction. On another level, capital necessarily goes through what we most often call growth, or what Marx calls expansion. He asks you furthermore to think in widening circles, in spirals, where production that needs to be reproduced adds more and more of more. Then it becomes important to think where the more comes from. Our beast has a giant gullet, sucking into its maw previous societal forms, serfs, landowners, capitalists too of course, and raw materials. Fruits of the earth that often have to be wrested from it by force, as well as the intellectual capacities of whole societies and epochs. When it needs to grow, where does it find more to suck in? Capital is relentlessly creative in finding the more it wants and needs to make the more of more it can't live without. It finds it in the productivity of workers, through inventive machines that speed up and intensify their work. It imperializes and colonizes land, goods, and peoples. It draws into the workforce previously unemployed populations in Marx's mid-19th century milieu. This included women and children, who had not entered the industrial labor marketplace before in any numbers. Now it draws into the workforce people who previously existed in different societal systems, as subsistence farmers or in other modes, where they still exist. It is also true that the system sucks in not only new materials, labor, and land, on the production side, but also markets and consumers, without which it could not realize its more of capital. In the middle chapters of Volume 1, you are asked to think the way capital overruns whatever limits are placed on it. When workers in 19th century England collectively fought back against long workdays of 10, 12, 14, and more hours, and when they won with legislation prohibiting long workdays. Factory owners fought back by wringing more labor out of them in shorter times through intensification and other productivity increases. Such a beast crashes through, sidles around, or digs underneath any limit set before it. Perhaps the hardest thing to get used to in capital is one thought figure. It is related to the doubling that happens all over the system and the book. Nowhere really does Marx condemn the capital system or call for revolution. That would be futile, maybe even silly. The system was taking over the world, and you would play right into its own personifying gesture to judge it as though it were a thinking, willing agent. Like a sovereign state that could be countered with force. It is not one, it is an aggregate of actors and processes that together, despite the contingency of any particular deal, always works out in favor of the system. At only one point in the book does Marx recall his earlier revolutionary anger and evoke a future where capitalists, who had expropriated land and labor, get paid back in kind. The expropriators will be, he says, expropriated, by a liberated and educated mass of workers. Despite this remnant of a manifesto, this cry for a future in which the whole system will have been overturned and turned into something better for everyone. The overwhelming mood of the book is ambivalence, another kind of double. Ambivalence is the double attitude Marx adopts toward the behemoth, which had become, in his mind, a largely immovable fact. The beast is marvelous. Look at all it does and can do. It reproduces itself year in and year out, overrides limits toward endless accumulation, wastes people's life energies at the same time as it feeds, clothes, and houses them. And produces an abundance never before seen on earth, just when it plunders and wrecks the same earth, through abstractions ensuring that its own concretions get spread to every nation, every village, every forest, making the people dwelling there precarious and expendable. As marvelous as it is also, as you can see, terrible and terrifying. The final chapters describe the way Marx saw capital's marvelous and terrible history from the vantage point of the 1860s. How with bloody violence peasants were turned into workers in the first place. Ambivalence, the system is neither good nor evil, or rather, it is good and evil having become the exclusive standard for both. Nevertheless, it has to be changed. Some hints about how this change could come about are given by Marx, also in an ambivalent register. Take for example the way industry produces an industrial reserve army of surplus labor. How could a new industry spring up without laborers standing by to fill it? The system gleefully throws huge numbers of people out of work whenever it needs to. It also gleefully immiserates the population as it tries to drive wages down. At the same time, the modern machine factory enables a new mode of social interaction, cooperation, which workers can only learn in the factory, and which could also become pivotal in a future socialized economy. Immiseration and cooperation, both are products of this system, which is on the whole beyond good and evil. Only if you're comfortable with a non-judging attitude, with ambivalence, can you see the small ways a different mode of sociality is being produced in the belly of the beast. Capital's in discipline. Marx's book belongs in many disciplines, some would argue in all of them. Scholars of philosophy, economics, sociology, political theory, history, and even literary studies claim it as indispensable for their methods and objectives. They teach it in classes and reflect on it in articles and books. Marx, although he carried out his investigations in a way that was meticulous and methodical, didn't belong to a particular discipline or, for that matter, to a particular profession. He was neither an academic nor a policy maker, he was neither a consultant to business nor a lobbyist to government. Marx worked in a space apart, which may not exist now, a place where revolutionaries met with thinkers, and thinkers gave speeches at worker congresses and on the barricades of nascent revolutions. He worked with disciplinary materials, but in a zone outside disciplinary rules and peer and career pressures, a zone you could describe as undisciplined. In this zone he could freely combine elements from several methods, bringing tools from one, idealist philosophy, into another, political economy in this small but significant way. You could say Marx actually expropriated the appropriators. At the same time, he brought real-world problems of political economy, the puzzles over how wealth is created and how the means for creating wealth were changing in historic ways, into philosophy as a topic worthy of rigorous, methodical, and intense reflection. He performs a special alchemy between strongly bounded disciplines, bringing Hegelian thinking to bear on political economy's method and political economy's objects of study and bringing political economy's objects and insights to bear on Hegelianism, such that neither remains the same. What we know as the discipline called economics formed its practices in the second half of the 18th century, though under a slightly different name. As we know, Marx refers to and thinks of himself as working in an intimate relationship with political economy, a field that features well-known names like Smith, Thomas Malthus, and Ricardo, as well as other lesser-known figures whom Marx mentions often as well, like the French Jean-Baptiste Say, the English Nassau W. Sr., and the American Henry Carey. In the 17th century, people began using the term political economy, often with reference to an ancient treatise on economics then ascribed to Aristotle, now thought to have been written by one of his students. The pseudo-Aristotelian oikonomia elaborates rules for managing a household, giving the nomos for the oikos, and then extrapolates good house management to larger political entities such as cities and palaces. Modern political economy had a very different content. It provided policies needed to run a modern nation-state, like managing a royal treasury and raising taxes, or like supporting and regulating private commerce within and between states. Political economy was truly political before the late 19th century. It was very close to what today we call political theory. When Adam Smith summed up this new science as being about the wealth of nations, he was accepting but also modifying the received meaning, since the wealth of the nation, or so he claimed in 1776, resided not in the king's coffers but primarily in citizens' daily working lives and attempts to procure their own well-being. For Smith, a nation's wealth was the aggregate commercial activity of those who lived, worked, reproduced, and died within its territorial boundaries. An example of an early political economist is French theorist François Quesnay, an important pioneer who reconceptualized the new thing called a national economy, inventing an important instrument for analyzing it, the economic table. Marx refers to Quesnay several times in Volume 1. Using Quesnay's table, you can see at a glance the source of wealth which Quesnay insisted was agriculture. Setting up the school of thought later called the physiocrats alongside the routes by which wealth gets distributed across social divisions, which take the shape of socio-economic classes. A marvelous intellectual invention, the economic table made some assumptions that still inform economic thinking. First of all, economics' object of study is expenditures, which are not static but exist in a movement or flow. Secondly, the independent actors and groups in a state all contribute to the whole. An economy is like an organism, with distinct chains of dependency. In Quesnay's model, all sectors ultimately depending on the agricultural sector for continued production and reproduction. These were the main questions answered by the table, and they are still by and large the central questions in this mode of thought. Where the source of value is, what the main divisions in society are, and how expenditures flow between them. Henceforth, and in keeping with important shifts in ideals over the 18th century, economics became the science that studied the welfare of a political people, often in order to promote, not only to study, their welfare. Economics still has this character, regardless whether economists think that the ultimate ideal is popular welfare, the creation of wealth, or individual success. Regardless whether economics' ultimate object is indeed the individual or the people or the corporation or the state. Modern economics was born out of a general spirit of progress in which intellectual figuring was supposed to tell us how this new thing, the economy, worked, and then to identify procedures for improving it. The spirit of progress and the task of improvement are often gathered under the loose heading Enlightenment. It is important to remember that modern economics was cultivated under this heading, and it keeps that particular flame, be it political economy or econometrics, classical, neoclassical, Keynesian, or Marxoid. Economic thought always pursues the ideal of improvement. Even if its schools and movements and worldly philosophers fail to agree on the correct analysis of conditions or the proper methods for analyzing or improving them. Political economy, in Marx's sense, will seem alien to many. In today's central economies, but also in peripheral economies where, under the drive to develop, economic orthodoxies viciously take hold. The categories in today's economics differ from the main categories in what Marx calls classical political economy. What has come to be called, again loosely, neoclassical economics, has a very different account of the sources of value, the derivation of prices, the relative stability of economies, the origin of crises, and the conditions for long-term development. Not to mention the correct methodology for economic science. Classical political economy, Marx's theoretical reference point, presents value as deriving chiefly from labor inputs. For Ricardo, commodity prices do fluctuate according to supply and demand, but they are pulled toward a center of gravity around the costs of production, chief among them labor costs. Classical political economy already presents the distribution of wealth as unbalanced in favor of capitalists. Inequality is endemic to the system and something to be constantly monitored and battled. The division of labor in capitalist societies leads to divisions we are used to calling classes, and those classes fight over the revenues from their economic activities. The classicals also tend to believe in balancing forces, which they call laws, that govern these potentially turbulent activities. To determine the laws which regulate this distribution is the principal problem in political economy, Ricardo wrote in the preface to On the Principles of Political Economy and Taxation in 1817. 1 year before Marx was born. To the extent that he also takes the derivation of economic laws as the main task of the science, and insofar as he also takes up many of Ricardo's categories. Marx is sometimes considered a Ricardian himself. He certainly shares the view that economic relations are human, all too human, that fair distribution of social goods is the goal to be reached. And that the object of study is not the individual or the system but the social relations underpinning them, which get their main shape through the types of labor carried out in a society. Today's economists debate in specialized journals and in popular media whether human beings are fully rational actors or not and whether government agencies should intervene in commerce, finance, or labor markets, or not. These debates take for granted another conception of value and its source. Value for neoclassical type economists is determined by the psychology of consumers. How many of these do I want? Is the decisive question. Moreover, the market is by nature free, completely self-regulating, and the proper methodology for studying this automatic distribution mechanism as well as the aggregate of consumer choices is mathematical formalism. There are as many variations on these neoclassical commitments as there are economists, but the basic outline of neoclassical economics is relatively stable. It takes its model consciously from Newtonian physics, imagining the economy to be a system that is essentially stable, which, when disturbed, naturally returns to equilibrium so long as external forces like states don't meddle too much in it, and whose processes and elements are fully determined. So that a science of them only needs to perfect its knowledge or method to approximate the perfection and lucidity of the system. In this tale, economic science continually improves its findings and its method to better approximate the perfect system, and, at the same time, it counsels economic actors in the system to perfect their actions by studying economics, in order to take better advantage of the system. A rational actor is the one who can best take advantage of a rational system. Every version of economics believes economies behave according to laws, from Ricardo to Marx to Milton Friedman to Joseph Stiglitz. Some versions of economics, neoclassical and Keynesian, both believe that the correct use of human reason will allow humans to best conform to those laws. Although Keynesians famously temper optimism, denying that human actors can know enough to reasonably act in every situation. As you will learn in Capital, Marx would have, had he lived to hear this, rejected many tenets of contemporary economics. Markets are not just imperfect, they drive individuals, businesses, industries, populations, and entire economies to ruin. The capital system's bloody past, in which force and law were used to dispossess groups living under different social forms of their livelihoods in order to convert them into wage workers, does not disappear once the system gets established. It lives on as other abuses, sometimes more refined and slower, but seldom less devastating. Furthermore, the system may be rational, if that means it has a set of laws that can be known. but human beings living within it cannot access the logic of the system without a critical shift in their thinking. No amount of deducing or ratiocinating can make the system clear or advantageous to them. It catches them up in insane machinations and spits them out when they don't suit its contingent ups and downs. Ruthlessly rational the system may be, but that is to no one's particular advantage and to everyone's ultimate disadvantage. For Marx, as for Ricardo and to a lesser extent Smith, the basic element of capitalist society is not the individual but the class. This is one of the biggest changes the system wreaks. The individual soul alone before its God in search of grace in Lutheran religion becomes one class confronting another class in a struggle over access to earthly goods, to the requirements of life. Employment is never perfect, but the system is more than merely imperfect. Huge swaths of workers must, not because of their needs but because of the system's needs, continually fall out of work, waiting at the lowest level of subsistence, at the limit of life, to be available when an industry grows and needs their labor again. Whole regions of the globe will be turned from closed, subsistence economies into wage slavers for goods exported elsewhere. Value is created by this labor, in the sphere of production. And although circulation is necessary to realize value, a product must be sold or else no value is actually created. Consumer choice is not essentially involved. Indeed, nobody is choosing in Marx's speculative construction of the invisible whole. The market is not free, but constrained, and constraining. Individuals, workers, and capitalists alike submit to the needs of the system so that it can produce and reproduce itself and grow. Marx's great innovation is to discover that the endemic inequality at the heart of purported equality, which Ricardo hinted at, is intractable in this system. What I trade when I earn a wage is always greater than what I receive in return. Given the pressures on the system to not only reproduce itself as it is but to expand, I can expect even worse. I call this the satanic ratio, where the more I work the less I earn proportional to my labor outlay. Things become even more satanic. Since it is in the interest of employers to stretch as far as possible over time the portion of your labor they get for free and to diminish as far as possible the portion of your labor for which they have to pay. This picture contrasts starkly with that provided by neoclassical and other contemporary economic theories and also goes beyond classical political economy in important ways. Though it doesn't only critique Ricardo in economic terms. Capital goes beyond economic thinking. Although Marx's father wanted him to study law, and he did for a time, as a student Marx was passionate about literature and philosophy. He wrote poems in the idioms of his idols, aping the bombast of the Sturmuendy-Drang movement and the airy transcendence of literary romanticism. At the same time, he was mapping the philosophical landscape of the German 1830s, which was dominated by the problematics and vocabulary of Hegel. As I discuss above, Marx broke with the Hegelians and their dogmas spectacularly in the 1840s, through vicious critiques of the movement's representatives. And by turning squarely to political economy and reformulating the philosophical project in the hard-hitting text he wrote against Hegel, called Critique of Hegel's Philosophy of Right. Yet, while working on his next critique, of political economy, in the 1850s, Marx came to believe that a few Hegelian thought figures that he had partly dismissed could take his critique of political economy beyond simple criticism. Beyond the impulse to improve Ricardo's concepts in their own terms. Hegel had been wrong, his philosophy did not apply to the human mind and the modern state and to all of human history. However, it applied in some measure to the capital system, which was a totality coming into existence at a particular point in history and running a specific course with an ironclad necessitarian logic. Hegel had been partially right, but about the wrong object. In Hegelian philosophy, there were no natural objects, only historical ones. Beings had a historical ground. Historical entities were complex and they moved through circuits and phases, just as economic entities did for Marx. Reality, for Hegel, was a moving whole, which brought together the strangest bedfellows and reconciled opposites in healthy tensions. This was a good thought contraption to help Marx rethink capitalism as something new on the earth, as a historical organism making its own peculiar sense. At the top of the list of inventions in the field historians of philosophy label German idealism stands a dynamical concept of relationality best named Wechselwirkung, which could be translated in English as reciprocal action. Unlike the relatively inert entities of other philosophies, in idealism, one thing acts upon another and the other thing acts back. The two mutually modifying one another in the process, to produce a third thing not contained in either alone. This is the core thought figure in Hegel's logic, and it helps Marx articulate the system beyond economic categories. Reciprocal action and determination between positions between, for example, subjects and objects was intuited and put to use by the early post-Kantian philosopher Johann Gottlieb Fichte. It was developed first as a methodological instrument by Friedrich Wilhelm Joseph von Schelling and made into the central principle of thought and reality by Schelling's one-time friend, Hegel. For his critique of political economy, Marx explores the form of reciprocal action that had come to be described as dialectical. In fact, though, in the Capital Venture, Marx makes use of several logics. To start, the logic based on equivalence from political economy is still very much alive. To this he adds the dialectics of Hegel based on the idealist motif of Wechselwirkung. On top of dialectics, he brings in a logic of material interchange he adapts from organic chemistry and biology that he sometimes calls metabolism. Along with a logic of feedback mechanisms in his description of circulation, and a logic of instability and nonlinear dynamics in his theory of historical change and crises in the capital system. Marx's indiscipline allows him to pick and choose among logics, and the conflict of logics cannot be captured by any single approach to the text, whether economic, dialectical, ecological, or historical. All are in play at different moments across the Capital Venture, and no one logic is definitive for Marx's analysis of the capital system. This too makes his venture peculiar. Each of the logics Hegelian dialectical, economic equivalence theoretical, biological metamorphic, feedback disruptive leaves its traces in the Capital Venture, which appears in the form of an enormous heap of drafts, versions, editions, and translations. Work on the Capital Venture, depending how you count, spans 20, 30, or nearly 40 years. Starting from his initial plans to study political economy in the early 1840s, the project of self-education and working through and writing and rewriting filled 4 decades to his death in 1883. Yet the Capital Venture has not always been understood as a messy heap. Some noticed, Enrique Dussel, the exiled Argentine philosopher and reader of Marx, once calculated that the published Volume 1 represents 1/72 of what Marx projected to write and publish in the project. Only since the great advances in the second German critical edition, the Marx-Engels Gesamtausgabe. Over the last 50 years has it become clear that the range of texts pertaining to capital is so eclectic that it can't in any meaningful way be called whole or complete. And, further, that Marx's arguments go through many changes, with some crucial earlier arguments getting abandoned along the way. The arguments, like the logics they draw on, are not contained in any one volume. They span the projected volumes, notes, drafts, and letters. Only the first volume of Capital was published under the guidance of Marx himself. The books published as volumes 2 and 3, which contain investigations and arguments as crucial for understanding the capital system as any in volume 1, were valiantly collated from different manuscripts and edited with great care, and many good editorial decisions, by Engels during the last decade of his life. For volume 1, Marx brought 2 German editions of it into print, plus a translation into French that he was directly involved in. Translations into English to date have taken only the 3rd and 4th editions, edited and collated by Engels, as their sources. It is very hard to see the collations and edits that Engels made, however, in those editions and the translations made from them, without extensive study. And for this reason the current edition takes Marx's 2nd German edition as its basis. With reference to the now canonical changes in the French edition in an appendix and in an afterword by William Clare Roberts.
So that all seems quite clear, doesn't it? No, it doesn't. I would hope that, you sort of bear with us through looking at this. Actually, this is a good introduction. It does cover all the kinds of questions and some of the new language that is probably necessary to look at Marx. That is inversioning, which is, I suppose it's a lot older word, but it's one that nobody uses. Lots of words like that. And it could be simply that you could pass it off as jargon, but the concept of inversioning, that is the idea of taking something in sequence and then elevating the second step in such a sequence to a primary position. I know that sounds like a lot of mumbo jumbo, but it's not simple juxtaposition or contiguity between two things. It is rather a moving forward in a particular kind of, I suppose, a cardinal direction to do that. But anyway, and none of you understood what I was saying there anyway, so let's not worry so much about it. This was, for those who come in late, this was a use of a text-to-speech converter, because at some moment I'm probably going to use a much better one, an AI one that will just simply make the job a little easier and more consistent for things I want to do. So anyway,
I understood, Professor Ann. You were talking about birds. You mentioned the cardinal.
yes, indeed, the Cardinals, like the Stanford Cardinal, which is who's it's the mascot, Stanford University, and it's the Stanford Cardinal rather than like the University of Louisville, the Louisville Cardinals with an S. And the reason why I would assert, and I haven't looked this up, I mean, the idea I think was originally the idea of cardinal as referring to the color itself, cardinal red, but also because it had a scholastic inference being a cardinal, but also perhaps something more mathematical as in cardinal logic, but also to counter the color used for Harvard, that is the Harvard crimson, and so that's why it's the cardinal. And of course, my joke is, why there must be a university that is an ordinal. But anyway, which is a math joke. Anyway, so and during the time when they were considering a new name, because the Stanford mascot for its sports teams was called the Indians, clearly a problematic thing, especially considering that all those robber barons gave money to Stanford University. And in fact, there was that period where wags suggested that instead of renaming it something else, and not Indians, that they name it the robber barons, which I would have much preferred.
Yeah.
I mean, there are the student princes of Otterbein, so there are mascots that have really dumb names. So, so much for pedantry. Let me move to the next step. But I've included Christian Fuchs, rereading Marx in the Age of Digital Capitalism. Let's see what time are we looking at here? I probably used up all my time on this digital stuff. Almost. Well, let me just point this out in case you actually decide to read this. It's the introduction and the first chapter or two of a book by Christian Fuchs, Fuchs, Rereading Marx in the Age of Digital Capitalism, 2018, I think. No, 2019. Anyway, it's a decent book. As I've mentioned before, Fuchs is one of the few people who sort of moved Marxist analysis of communication or the communication industries or mass communication forward. There are some other folks, but he's one who bridges the German and the British. I mean, I think he has a position at a British university, but most of his stuff has a German thing going on. And so I may read a little bit of this just to give you a little flavor of it, because it does, in these couple of chapters that I've included for today's little page, it does include all the things that we've been looking at before. It just includes, not unlike the discussion of Marx, that you can't sort of deal with it all in one simple logical order, but rather multiple logics, which, I think is very modern in that particular sense, or very Marxian. People don't appreciate that. But people prefer it in a nice rigid form. And needless to say, in terms of the history of the Soviet Union, it's better to have it in a rigid form. Otherwise, you have all kinds of deviationism or all these other sub-tendencies, liquidationism, accelerationism, all these little tendencies, which are, well, some people died, let's put it that way. So let me just read a little bit of this. The year 2017 marked the 150th anniversary of the publication of Volume 1 of Marx's Capital, and 5 May 2018 was Karl Marx's bicentenary. After decades of marginalization, we today find a repeated interest in Karl Marx's work. This book asks the questions, why is Marx relevant today? How can we make sense of Marx in the age of digital and communicative capitalism? To reread something should include that we remember something, re-say and revoice it, do something again, and struggle for something again. That's very Marxian. Rereading Marx means remembering Marx's works, revoicing and re-saying Marx's ideas and politics, redoing his critique, and repeating the struggle against capitalism and for socialism. To redo something is never a mechanical mapping or reflection, but rather a creative dialectical process of, this word again, sublation, that preserves, eliminates, and creates something novel. So you could say that enversioning is a kind of logical form or similar idea that sublation might mean. The sublation conceptually comes from the German, I think. So to reread Marx is not a mapping of Marx, but a creative renewal of Marx's analysis in radical politics in the 21st century. With works such as, and I'm not going to read all of these things, Capital, Grundrisse, blah, 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 literally all the titles of his major works, Marx laid the foundation for the critique of capitalism's political economy. The approach he advanced operates with the help of categories such as all of these things. This is the stuff that you normally see in every Marxist text: commodity, work, labor, exchange value, use value, blah, 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 blah. And it's a long list. And I don't know why he does it this way, but he just goes on and on and on. Oh, where the hell is the end of this? Oh, I don't know. I think it just keeps going. Taken together, these categories form the foundations of a critical theory of capitalism and of its economic system, political system, cultural. He really likes these lists. Cultural system, its technological paradigms, the human nature relationship within capitalism, and aspects of subject-object, time and space in capitalism, period. Marx's approach is inherently critical, which means that it analyzes capitalism's contradictions, its crisis tendencies, struggles, and the foundations of alternatives to capitalism as the determinate negation of capitalism. 200 years of the development of Marxian theory have resulted in numerous approaches, strands, interpretations, debates, and conflicts. The rise of neoliberal capitalism in society, of postmodernism in culture and academia, and of identity politics, as together with the collapse of the Soviet Union, the degenerations brought about by various forms of Stalinism, and the neoliberalization of social democracy, resulting in a decline of Marxian-inspired theory and praxis during the past decades. Indeed. Francis Fukuyama, yes, who is at Johns Hopkins, or, well, no, he's not at Johns Hopkins, he's at Stanford. It's his retirement or whatever. He's at the Hoover Institute, I think. Francis Fukuyama was therefore able to postulate in 1992 that the end of history had arrived. This is very Hegelian, but also some other things. The end of history had arrived, and to claim that capitalism and liberal democracy would exist forever, which is a sort of overstated claim, and he got a lot of shit for it, so whatever. Many academics in the social sciences and humanities, to a certain extent, have practiced Fukuyamaism by forgetting about capitalism and the analysis of society's totality. They have instead focused on microanalysis, postmodernism, the attack on grand narratives and truth claims, and categories such as globalization, individualization, risk, networks, modernity, identity, etc. While Marx has increasingly become absent in theory and praxis, the class contradiction and inequalities have expanded so that he has, in light of his absence, paradoxically become more needed than ever before. 25 years later, societies and sociology have changed. The notion of capitalism has, in the light of capitalism's actual crisis, made a return into the public and sociological vocabulary. A new world economic crisis emerged in 2008, which is what we looked at in the class unity thing. It turned in many parts of the world into a political, social, austerity, ideological, and legitimacy crisis of capitalist society, as well as into the rise of new nationalisms and authoritarian forms of capitalism, as Christian Fuchs discusses in a 2018 book. Marx keeps on haunting capitalism in the 21st century. Talking about Marx means talking about class, capitalism, crisis, and alternatives to capitalism. It is therefore evident that Marx will remain our contemporary as long as capitalism continues to exist. The time has come to repeat Marx. In contemporary capitalism, knowledge labor, digital communication technologies, and information commodities play a significant role. One can therefore speak of digital capitalism or communicative capitalism as an important dimension of capitalism today. It is not the only dimension of capitalism because we also live simultaneously in finance capitalism, hyper-industrial capitalism, crisis capitalism, authoritarian capitalism, neoliberal, he really loves these lists, neoliberal capitalism, mobility capitalism, global capitalism, etc. All of these dimensions interact. This book gives particular attention to the relevance of Marx in the context of digital and communicative capitalism today, whereas in the 1990s and the first decade of the 2000s, it was difficult to talk about Marx without immediately being confronted with the prejudices against Marx. It's Terry Eagleton's book. So that a discussion about Marx and the critique of capitalism could not even be started. Today, there's more willingness to listen to what Marxist theory has to say. In the age where neoliberal capitalism is in deep political, economic, and ideological crisis and tends to turn to new authoritarian capitalisms, that's where we are right now, Peter Thiel, Trump et al., it has not just become, Musk, etc., it has not just become evident that the market and the commodity form cannot solve human problems. The commodity form in terms of a market, not going to solve everything. But also the time has come to once again take Marx and socialism seriously. Facing economic, political, and ideological crises, we have to reread and repeat Marx today. Rereading and repeating Marx does not mean to mechanically apply Marxist thought to 21st century society. It does not mean also to treat his writings as scriptures from which one repeats one and the same quotations over and over again. First, to reread and repeat Marx today means to develop analyses and critiques of class and capitalism in the 21st century in a historical and dialectical manner. It means to study how capitalism, not just as economic formation, but as societal formation, is transforming and damaging human lives, society, and nature. It means repeating Marx's categories, such as the commodity, labor, value, surplus value, class exploitation, capital exploitation, domination, ideological class struggles, means, relations, modes of production, means of communication, the general intellect, communism, etc. in the 21st century. He really likes these lists. Marx was both a historical and a dialectical thinker. To repeat Marx in the 21st century, therefore, neither means to abolish his approach, theory, and politics, nor to completely reinvent them, nor to leave them unchanged. That capitalism as a historical and dialectical system means that it changes through crises in order to remain the same system of exploitation. To reread and repeat Marx, therefore, means to sublate Marx's categories based on a dialectic of continuity and change. The same things that in the North preface that the machine just read, it's that same idea of things keep moving, but they don't remain the same, but they have a certain type of continuity. Whereas postmodernists have preached for decades that society has completely changed, orthodox social theorists claim that nothing at all has changed. Postmodernism is almost dead and overestimates change. The orthodoxy that nothing ever changes, in contrast, overestimates continuity. So here you have the dialectic of continuity and change. Fairly simple, but highly abstract. And you can see how that kind of operates within the Marxian context. Second, the contemporary capitalist age is profoundly ideological. To understand and change society, we therefore need to reread and repeat Marx's ideology critique. Through consumer culture and neoliberalism, we've experienced the commodification of almost every damn thing and the constant presence of ideologies that justify commodity logic in all realms of everyday life. Commodity fetishism as ideology immanent to capital itself has therefore become universal. Rising inequalities have resulted in the intensification and extension of ideologies that distract attention from capitalist society as the underlying cause of social problems. You know, immigrants, the immigrants do it. That's the problem. The most evident form of political fetishism has in recent times been the rise of new political nationalism. Darn those migrants. Third, to reread and repeat Marx today means to envision and struggle for alternatives to capitalism. Marx stresses that history is not predetermined and that humans make their own history. Even in dark times, it is never too late. And it is especially in such times important to envision alternatives and think of and work toward ways of how the gap between what could be and what is can be overcome. Capitalism is not the end of history. In order to humanize society, fundamental societal change is needed. This book, this is Fuchs's book, this book rereads and repeats Marx in the age of digital and communicative capitalism in 6 steps. Rereads and repeats Marx in the age of digital and communicative capitalism in 6 steps. Each step is organized as one chapter. To repeat Marx means to reread and reinterpret his major works today. So that's the kind of conceit that this particular book is built on. Chapter 2 is quite useful in the sense that it offers up the notion of rereading in a certain interesting way and includes trying to situate it in the information age. And it is a reconstruction of theory and concepts. So it includes the things that we've been reading before over these last couple of years. Heinrich, Capital itself, the reinterpretation of, you know, volume 1, etc., the things we're reading in the other context. So rereading is very important in all of those particular texts, and I won't drag you through that. But as you'll see, if you take the time, and I'm going to stop in a second, the rereading Marx's Capital in the Information Age does build it around, you know, the post-2008 kind of crisis and, you know, kind of need to rethink capitalism and class, particularly under financialization. So in this situation, also the question arises of how to read Marx. This concerns Marx's most widely read book, Capital Volume 1, that the UNESCO, the United Nations Educational, Scientific, and Cultural Organization, UNESCO, together with the Communist Manifesto, inscribed on the Memory of the World Register in 2013. Whereas the German edition of Capital that the publisher Dietz distributes as part of the Marx Engels Works, the MEW, or the MECW, the Marx Engels Collected Works, this number increased, blah, blah, blah. And needless to say, amidst Facebook, Google, Twitter, etc., the time has come to read Marx's Capital from a media and communication studies perspective, which is Fuchs's whole goal there. And so he, talks about his own books and tries to show how that all connects. And we may or not I've used a couple of his diagrams before to try and get you into the idea that, all this stuff yammering about use value and exchange value actually becomes adapted or altered, transmogrified, however you want to think about it, under advanced communication in an information economy. So but the thing is, capitalism is, however, not homogeneous, but a differentiated dialectical unity of diverse capitalism. We do not have to decide between information capitalism or finance capitalism or other capitalism, such as hyper-industrial capitalism, mobile capitalism, etc., but have to see capitalism manifold dimensions that mutually encroach each other. The sort of German construction there. But we will note that the information economy is itself highly financialized, as, for example, the 2000 dot-com crisis and the constant flows of venture capitalism into Silicon Valley show. And that's where we are now, right? The failure of FTX, NFTs, cryptocurrency, etc. And information technology is one of the drivers of financialization, as indicated by algorithmic trading, credit scoring algorithms, or digital currencies such as Bitcoin. The computer is a universal machine that, as network information technology, has affected all realms of everyday life, not just industry, labor, and the economy. It is a convergence technology that is, together with other societal developments, advanced social convergent tendencies of culture and the economy, work time and leisure time, the home and the office, consumption and production, productive and unproductive labor, the public and the private. There's a lot of German construction going on here. Reading Capital from an information perspective can therefore not be limited to the realm of media technologies and media content, but has to be extended to communication in society at large. And yes, communications is still the blind spot of Marx's theory, but that's a whole thing that he's going to do here. So he's looking at Eagleton, his own work, Jameson, etc. And there's a little prop to Jameson's Representing Capital, a reading of Volume 1. And it's a useful interpretation, but perhaps it is even in its own construction dated, but that's another story. So there's Hilda, the rest of this is a compendium of books that hopefully you'll find interesting, some of which are kind of classic books, Raymond Williams, all stuff, Gramsci, Dyer Whitford's a book on cyber Marx. There's a canon of discussion that all built essentially still on the post-war analysis of a humanist Marxism with the usual churning that includes Althuserian Marxism, et cetera, et cetera. So that's all there. Stop now. You can read this at your leisure and skip through all of the major. He really loves these lists. I think what it is these lists are very useful because if you're teaching a course, you can just you have all this stuff listed that makes it easier for students to sort of plow through the work. So it has that sort of lexical bias. Anyway, questions, comments? Off to protest. Kelly left. Hopefully, the state will get smashed.
There are some sometimes, like right now, there's a big black thing covering up half the screen.
That's
Uh,
chat. That's the chat.
Oh, oh, okay.
I'm just looking at the chat to see if there are any other kinds of questions. Satanic
It's,
ratio.
it's still on the screen.
I know.
Oh, I'm sorry.
There it is. There's a kitty on it too. Anyway. Yeah. The voice
Yeah,
of kitty.
I think the confusion is we only see the black, not the actual chat. So,
Yeah.
but
I know.
anyway, now we know.
It's gone now.
Now we know.
But relax.
It's not gone. It's still a black bar at the top of your page.
Gone now. Gone now.
No, now it's gone. Yay! Thank you. Thank you, Ann.
Anything
Oh,
else?
the wonders.
Questions, queries, other than my usual, digressions.
I have a question.
Sure.
Kind of general, very general thing about Marx. It's been hanging over my head, kind of bugging me is when we talk about Marx, you know, is one of the blind spots the the way that we're perhaps generalizing more than warranted the terms like stages of history to be okay, that's a global phenomenon and everything is like that's the um, kind of the state of the art of being human. But really, is Marx just losing the context that okay, this is true for Europe, you know, and not. I mean, it's the economic power of the world.
Well,
What
this is
is
the question of structure agency kind of stuff, is that can a, how universal or how ubiquitous are, systems or structural concepts in terms of applying it to reality, to the natural world, to the natural and human world. And I would assert to you that there are developmental things that societies or cultures go through. They just don't go all through them all at the same time. They go through them in different phases, some of which are faster, slower, some are more compressed. There's a whole argument about whether, for example, communism or of a certain type should be able to leapfrog over a feudal past. You can sort of jump from the feudal or the primitive, the early feudal to the early modern in sort of one giant step. And that's a very significant argument. I mean, it is an argument that is continuous throughout communism or whatever. The Great Leap Forward, for example, in the post, the emergent revolutionary government of China, it was a serious issue for the first 10 years. And, the solutions weren't very good, considering that, a lot of people died and that shouldn't have happened, but it did. And it did for, not necessarily because of Stalinism, but certainly because of certain cultural constraints and a lack of sort of thinking about, being open to other kinds of developmental ideas. Whereas the China of the more recent decades, because it has decided to accept market economies, et cetera, is doing much better.
yeah, and that's
I'm sorry to have, trod over you there. Finish your thought, please.
oh no, that's good. Yeah, it's hard to get at my question. Let me try an example. Like even the word primitive is like saying, I think of, I'm kind of have a highly suspect that other like pre-Columbian Western Hemisphere, let's say, and the Africa, all these societies that were, let's say, before they came under the influence of the global European system, they may have had advanced ways of, kind of just to put it in extremely general broadness. Uh, Maybe they had more state-of-the-art things in terms of being a human being. Maybe I'm going beyond the relevance of discussing Marxism, but there had been advances in other places of the world, and in times past, perhaps there had been advances that are unknown now, and we've lost. And when we look at, like for example, this other podcast, the host decided to start reading Rousseau, and I read along, and it was very. I'm very glad I read it. Everyone should read a little of Rousseau, and of course, all the others. But when they're talking about it, it's always there's kind of this presumption that that's the uh, the leading edge, the forefront of societal evolution globally. I'm always wanting to put in okay, bracket it and say that this is in context of European, and also the context of this is all men talking about it. We don't, the
Yeah,
whole
yeah, yeah. It's hegemonic. It's
hegemonic,
misogynist.
exactly.
It has all that shit in it. Uh, you know, this is why most world history courses are badly configured or taught. It has a Eurocentric bias. It privileges the settler colonialism. It diminishes the sort of the essence or the uniqueness or the authenticity of pre-modern cultures. It's a whole thing and it's changed. Anthropology has changed it as a field. So things are better now. They used to be really dumb, but they're still dumb stuff. For example, there are people on the planet who probably do most things in a fairly modern way, but still believe that that a significant amount of the technology that we have has been given to us by aliens, right? I mean, extraterrestrial aliens.
Uh,
It's a persistent myth. It's an interesting myth. It's one that persisted in the 19th century that these indigenous peoples that you come across in America, um, they seem pretty darn primitive. And so there must have been, this is the lost tribe theory, uh, that there must have been from someplace closer to the Fertile Crescent a tribe that existed prior to these indigenous peoples, or something that has hitherto been lost. And of course, it is configured or juxtaposed an entire other set of myth that includes Jews. Sort of it's a way of weirdly explaining Jewish culture within the context of the larger Judeo-Christian culture. And it drives certain developments, right? Um, if you look at Mormonism, Mormonism has something of that built into it, and which allows it to be incredibly racist as well. But whatever. That in 19th century thought you have actually that kind of stuff going on. What's worse, of course, is that some people in the 21st century still insist that, well, it must have been blah 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 blah. There's the fossil record. It always gets polluted by some ideological position, which usually is absurd. made even more absurd when people do a little bit more archaeology. Um, um, and there are dominant theories that existed for decades, about whatever it is, plate tectonics. By the time you get to plate tectonics, a very different way of thinking about the planet. Whatever. So it's uneven. Let's just, cut to the chase. And the idea is that it'd be nice to have a singular model. I think it's just a combination of models.
Yeah, it always is, I think. And well, here's another example. And I should read more Marx. I mean, I could read to get the answer, but
I don't think not all answers are in Marx. Let's be clear about that.
okay, so my question is, how much does Marx acknowledge that these economies he's looking at are there's all this wealth being supplied by this settler colonial and hegemonic expansion of European power, and that effect on the globe, is that touched on in Marx?
Yeah, I mean, he has this whole construction about how is it that certain anthropological things occurred? How is it, and some of it's correct, others of it are, don't make much sense. But that's just writing about it in the 19th century. That's not an answer for the 21st century. It's very interesting because it has certain notions about science or whatever. And that's kind of when we were reading Bellamy Foster. The nice thing about Bellamy Foster is that it compares the fact that you have these dominant positions on science or on anthropology or on culture, on evolution that were very problematic, but not so problematic now, and are still questionable at certain types of levels. But you're not going to build whole religions on these marginal differences, which is unfortunate, the problem that exists now. And you sort of people in the 21st century who aren't fundamentalists of one kind or another, have sort of accepted that science has a way of kind of explaining all this shit, and you can sort of still have your faith or whatever. And that's I think Marx allows for that as a materialist. He kind of acknowledges it's there. It's delusional, it's opium, it's but it's there. I mean, Marx is actually quite tolerant of those things, mainly because he sort of sees, well, I think some of this is going to get worked out. I think he has a certain faith about that. Not simply a Hegelian faith, just a faith that I think that he understands that, we're going to move forward and things will, sort of get better, but we can't do stuff sort of built on these kind of anachronistic or, really stupid notions, which is getting in the way of progress. That's what I would, Marx is a modernist that, he believes in progress. He believes that, stuff's going to change, it is somewhat refreshing in some ways that he's just sort of saying, well, it's not all as absolute as, this is his objection to Hegel, that's just not it. I mean, everybody's sort of reading this stuff, but they don't really sort of come to grips with a real world. And that's kind of the refreshing part of Marx, is he always tries to sort of stay in a relatively real set of circumstances. It wasn't all pleasant by any means. But I think he could see all of these things sort of interrelated, and it was sort of you could say it's a good time to sort of be Marx on the one hand. On the other hand, there were carbuncles, so whatever.
Yeah.
I don't know if that answers your question. I did. It just seems to me that we don't look to Marx for answers. All we're looking at is sort of a style of inquiry, and it's a good style of inquiry. It's a reasonable style of inquiry. It's not only some people have decided to make it into some sort of absolute, and it's just not. It never was, never is. Um, and yet it is flexible enough to allow us to do things like fight for a revolution, fight for social change. All of those things are still there. Even in the 21st century, we know that towards the end of Marx's life, he was looking at all kinds of stuff, that this is the point of the humanist analysis, like Marcello Musso, who talks about, well, he was looking at Russia, he was trying to learn Russian, for a variety of reasons that, include the obvious way in which, Marxism becomes integrated into changes in Russia. But he was interested in India at the same time. So there's other things that go on. And towards the end of his life, and he acknowledged that, that it's not all going to be answered in his lifetime, nor in Engels' lifetime, for that matter. And in fact, they would laugh at the way some people have, sort of enshrined as both of their thought, but all the other associated thoughts as well.
Yeah. Yeah, that sounds good.
I mean, you could find answers for very specific things, but they're not all that viable from a 19th century, from a 21st century point of view. What's important is to remember that, some things are real, some things are imagined. The reconciliation of these ideas still is, it is a philosophic procedure on the one hand. On the other hand, philosophers don't know what they're doing. So, you shouldn't remain in that realm, because people who remain in that realm, there's a certain moment at which I don't understand why there is a profession called philosophy. I mean, you can study philosophy within the context of the university, but as a sort of thing, it probably, maybe there shouldn't be PhDs in philosophy. But anyway.
Well, I hear some current Marx, self-proclaimed Marxists talking. The way they're talking, it sounds like they're coming from hegemony and not,
Yes.
they're not realizing it,
Well,
so
some people are just insecure about this stuff. It's better to talk about, your class origins, that there are certain determinations within that particular context. And then if you've read enough, you realize that that's only one level of thought. There's a whole other set of thoughts about thinking about things that are determined. It's not that easy. It's certainly one way of thinking, and I don't have any problem with it. But when people say, well, that's the only way, and you're a capitalist roader, or you're a petty bourgeois, blah blah blah, that do not get denounced and shit like that. That's where hegemony becomes a problem.
yeah, and I feel it confronted, or I see the fact of them not acknowledging their hegemonic point of view is just because of how it clashes with my lived experience.
Right.
Like that's not the world. What world? I'm living in a different world than you. You know.
Well, everyone tries to whip out their working class credentials, right? Yeah.
uh,
You get that sense in every discussion, don't you?
Working class. Oh, not sure. I'd have to
No, I
You
mean
know,
this
we
idea
are it rough.
of
take note of that.
class roots, I mean, that does happen.
You know, we
I
are
have
it
a,
rough.
I have a very mixed background. I
Uh,
come from Mexican immigrants, and they wanted their kid to be a PMC, which is what I became. And I've
Yeah.
worked
I
in,
mean, you just have to reconcile it, There are no people who are college professors in my family, or even in my extended family. And, you know, whatever. And I think I would have been better off with that background.
better off with what,
Well, my parents
Y-
been educators or something, but they weren't.
yeah.
So my audio just cut out for a short time, but I think I know what's going on. Anyway, yeah, and Lee, I'll have to agree about the whipping out the working class credentials. You know, my my life experience is very mixed, and I'm aware of sometimes feeling the need to express a certain identity or something, which is, yeah, I don't love that. But anyway, so, however, I'm going to say recently I heard an exception to this, and that was that guy who spoke at Class Unity.
Yeah.
He he was saying flat out, it's intellectuals and academics that are the revolutionaries, and working class people are basically not capable.
Well,
I'm pretty
if
sure he pretty
if you
much
look at
said that.
if you look at the history of most revolutionaries, they don't necessarily come from lower classes, right?
Right. So I'm not arguing with the point. I'm just more saying there's a person that didn't try and pretend he was working class. That's all.
Oh, yeah, of course. I mean, I can actually produce all the credentials of being in the working class. Um,
What
and
sort of dickhead wants to pretend that we're in the working class?
well, that's it has become
It's like
within a certain set of beliefs, it's become fetishized. And
Keir Starmer. My dad
yeah,
was a
yeah,
toolmaker.
yes, exactly. That's exactly it. And most people have some way of reconfiguring their history so that it appears more working class. Well, he clearly is a member of the bourgeoisie. I mean, that's just
Mhm.
and the fact that he, among others, has accepted being his title.
The
I
working
mean,
class don't want to be the working class. That's the point.
Say what again? Say that again, Lee.
The working class don't want to be the working class. That's the entire point.
yeah, the
No,
whole
right,
point.
right.
You
Of
know,
course, of course. Although
Because
I will say there was a brief period here when wages for factory work and auto assembly was so good. I think during that couple decades, people were pretty proud of being working class, and here anyway.
there's a different no. Pride is this is the thing. Pride is partly due to the fact that you're getting by. Because it is harder.
well,
The whole point is it's shit being working class. And if
it's
you
about
people who are proud to be working class tend to be working class. So it's not even really an issue. And the
yes,
only proud is because they're surviving, they're getting by, and
yes.
they're not letting it drag them down and take them under. That's it.
Mhm.
It's Marx talks about this in terms of sustenance or sustainability. You know,
Yeah.
you don't go
So
out deciding what the labeling your class status, your consciousness. Your consciousness comes because your lived experiences, whatever that is, that's keeping
It,
you
it's like
still there.
Train Spotting. When you watch Train Spotting and he goes, it's shite being Scottish. What he really means is it's shite being working class, because every working class person, when they watch that film, knows exactly what he's saying. Yeah, every middle class fan of the thing goes, ha, because they think he's just
right.
saying something funny and smart or whatever. Oh yeah, smart comment. That's not a smart comment. It is an absolute bag of one being
It's a
working class.
reality. I mean, I
It
with all due respect
is.
to the to Britain, that the class divisions are very clearly There's a lot very clear divisions, right?
Yeah.
Uh,
It-
And
and
King
they're
Storm
not
acting
here.
better to be Scottish than Irish. Let's put it that way. You know,
yeah.
right?
And,
And it's
Stormer,
better.
Stormer
Yeah.
got asked if he could define working class, and he couldn't.
Oh,
So-
well, geez.
Doesn't even know.
So,
Some
Nate,
people don't even know what it is.
being in the U.S., I got to say these divisions are not as clear, and and this is less.
Well, actually, I think they are. I think they are. But I think you're so far down the capitalist rabbit hole that people don't want to think that there's the definitive thing. There's definitely an the middle class and elite and the rich. It's still you've got the same class in America. It's just you
Yes.
don't
Well, yeah.
recognize
But
it.
here,
Right.
here's what I mean, though. What I mean is, people I know, but especially myself, it's a whole fucking mismatch of shit.
Yeah.
My grandpa was a dirt farmer and a very poor factory worker. Two of my uncles, one was a surgeon and a president of a hospital. The other one was a businessman and a pilot. And then my dad was a high school teacher. And then myself was not able to finish college. You might just say I chose not to. I don't know. Who knows? How do you determine free will? But whatever the case is, most of my life I have worked shit jobs and now live in public housing. So what class am I? But I also, growing up with an English teacher and having as many intellectual left-wing friends visit the house, I have some degree of education. So what the fuck class am I?
You're the underclass.
Well, I mean, you could really divide it that way. I mean, you know, some people don't have to work because they're trust fund babies or whatever, nepos of one kind or another. They just don't have to work. They don't have to have a job.
Thank
And
you,
then,
Ann.
you know, well, I mean,
Well,
just
well,
that's a reality. There's a lot of people who have enough wealth that they just don't have to work, and that's fine. And wage labor defines their reality. I mean, having a job defines their reality. And that's important for some folks, whatever.
Okay. I mean, that makes sense, but I'm just not quite sure how it follows from what I said. I will guarantee you I don't have a trust.
Well, I'm not blaming them for we just have something endowments are we just
Right. I think
luck of
what
the
I noticed here
draw.
in my experience in Madison, which is a, fairly wealthy city dominated by professionals and educated people, that I constantly run into people being confused and wondering why I'm articulate but poor.
Dude, you wouldn't have my accent in Britain.
See, that's
No,
what it's for.
yeah. No,
Yeah.
I figured that's something we have in common. But
Yeah, he wouldn't have my accent in Britain, dude. Uh,
I mean, the same thing does exist in the U.S. I mean, there's some
yeah.
people who sound like Daniel Patrick Moynihan and whatever, and then there's the rest of us. But in terms of American, class doesn't necessarily come with certain things. Although if you have a middle class, an American middle class accent, you can pretty much do what you want. It's just that when you start sounding sort of extreme in one particular regional dialect, other things, become associated with that. I mean, there's class divisions in, for example, Southern accents without getting into a whole thing on that.
Yeah.
But in England, it's like, it you go a couple of kilometers down the road and class and language and accent change, right?
Yeah. But even if you make it, if you be, even if you worked your ass off and you climb that ladder, it's a bit like color actually. It defines you. Your mouth defines. As soon as you open your mouth, if you're a billionaire and you've made it to the top and you're with all the right people and you haven't changed your accent, you're not going to be invited to certain parties. You know what I'm saying? It's still because there's an inherent distrust in accents in Britain. How did how did someone with
Well,
And
that
and
accent?
this is a thing here. My dad came from Wyoming, and
Yeah.
his they do have an accent there, and he definitely made a point of figuring out how to reduce that accent.
Now the
oh,
funny
I mean,
thing is,
that's a commodity. That's a commodity in and of itself.
yeah,
In Britain, they
yes,
advertise classes in accent reduction.
and yes, but also it can reverse in during the Britpop era and the cool Britannia era. People down south, even posh people, started affecting a Manchester accent purely because of Oasis, and it was for a brief period it was cool. It actually was cool to be working class and northern.
Well, that's the thing about Cockney too, isn't it? Though, I
Yeah.
mean, to be able, okay,
Well,
because Cockney has its own, whatever.
there's a thing called Mockney, whereas the people who oh, in front of mummy and daddy, this is how they speak. But soon as they're in the turn, it's like, "You all right, mate? How's it going? Fucking hell." There's loads of that shit. Um, it's weird.
Things you only say when you go to a football stadium.
Yes.
Nate, I think I agree with you from your perspective. That kind of lines up with my upbringing background. I think you're talking about Professor Hudson who said that.
Yes,
I forget his name,
Yeah,
but
yeah.
it's Michael
That was
Hudson.
that was a relief to hear because I've not experienced anything but regressiveness from my working class experience in life. But
yeah.
yeah,
It's
it's
unfortunate
much different in the
because
UK. There's a much more distinct line in the class strata.
But I think true. But I do think that at the beginning of the 20th century, there were a lot more
Yeah.
progressive working class
So
people here.
what I was going to say is that I imagine it has a lot to do, that identity or loss of identity has to do with the destruction of the working class the labor movement in what, the 30s, 40s, and something like that. I know
that's that's
from my
part of it.
grandfather's experience, it was quite bad.
Well,
And he was resentful the rest of his life after the 50s.
it's all integrated into a bunch of other things. That is suburbanization,
Hmm.
the change in
That's a
education,
huge problem.
um, the availability of radio. I mean, just changes people's way, people
Well,
talk.
yeah, that did change popular culture, and that's the whole point of popular culture.
Yeah.
People got rich doing it.
Well, it's
Mhm.
referred to in the literature as a kind of civilizing discourse. In other words, you learn how to speak. Well, that was the whole point. The theory of the Nickelodeon is that that's how migrants learned English, and so that the Nickelodeon is this itty bitty movie theaters in Manhattan. People.
Mhm.
That's how you learn to survive.
I have to
Oh yeah,
admit, I
that why they were called
really
Nickel.
don't mind losing my nasalized Ohio twang. Sure. That
Yeah.
just has to do with migration.
And this is James. I had a class story. I have a friend. He's older than I am. In fact, he's passed away. That's how old he is. But he was a descendant of the Vanderbilt Whitney fortune on the East Coast. And he used to tell me about growing up as a kid in that world. And sometimes they'd go to some party somewhere, and when he was a young lad, and then he'd find some kid at the party there that he got along with, and they'd start hanging out and chatting and whatever. And his mom would come by and kind of whisper in his ear. She'd say, NOC, and then walk off. And that meant not our class.
Yeah.
People still say that.
They probably
I mean,
still do.
Yeah.
I mean, these things are there. You can see that. Living in Connecticut, there's a difference between people who live not in the cities and people who live,
Well,
whatever.
Connecticut is an extreme case because all the cities, all the cities, because until, forever there was no state income tax. So
Right.
the urban parts of Connecticut were always poorer than the suburban parts and still are. Bridgeport,
Hartford, Bridgeport, whatever.
Bridgeport. And yes, Norwalk is an exception, but that's because it literally is right next to Greenwich.
Yeah, Greenwich.
20 minutes from Manhattan. Well, and Greenwich is its own thing. I mean, I have friends in Greenwich. Actually, I spend a lot of time in Greenwich.
You spent your mean time.
What?
Hey.
Yes.
You spent your mean time there.
Yes.
Well, if I can just go back to, so I described, the various things that are part of my history and identity. And I guess what, the reason I did that is I assume most people have, or, lots of people have similarly mixed backgrounds and experiences. And so, in Marxist economic terms, it makes sense to me to analyze class. But the way we do things, at least in modern America and the whole time I've been alive, is there's so much emphasis on personal identity, and whether it's whether it's a progressive trying to prove their credentials, or it's a elitist trying to prove their superiority.
Yes. But that's the difference between class and class. Because the upper class have zero class.
Well, that's the difference between class and status. I mean,
yes. Yeah.
And actually, I was just going to say this because I grew up. I remember growing up. My father was a high school teacher. My mother was a commercial artist. They were both, my father was college educated. My mother was art school educated. But they hung out with mostly people from their community theater group, which were they were professionals, but of that level, like kind of professors and teachers. And I just remember thinking class to me back then, and this is just my childhood perspective or adolescent perspective, was about level of education. It seemed in my little brain, it seemed like it had to do with, because it was drummed into me, you've got to get a college degree, you have to get, it's all about education. So it wasn't about income, it was about how, in fact, the people who were the quote unquote nouveau riche, and that was the term that was used back then. Then there was a town set in the Leonia and north of where I grew up that was, we always looked down on it because it was nouveau riche, quote unquote, because it was like big ostentatious houses, which by now,
the working class don't use the term nouveau riche.
No, and I was definitely not working class. I considered I don't know what I was middle class. I'm still middle class. But I thought of class as, in my head, class was differentiated by level of education, not amount of money.
Nouveau riche is that a type of dessert? Sorry, Okay.
But I think that also comes out of an era when there wasn't so much, such vast differences and,
Mm. So,
income
I mean,
disparity.
what you were saying, James, I mean, yeah, that's pretty much sums up my personal confusion. And I think it's, it's partly living in a university town. I mean, it's, demographically on the whole, whether it's the old Madison, there's the old Madison, which is actually working class. Then there's the University Madison. And I mean, oversimplifying, but, and now there's, of course, all the young tech workers. And it is a big, if you don't happen to know, it's a major research university.
Yeah.
And so it's not just that there's professors and a bunch of grad students, there's all kinds of scientists here.
Right.
So, and I don't, when I've had, driving cab, the reason I loved driving cab so much is that group of people was so diverse. It was very easy for me to feel at home there.
Yeah.
And they just constitutionally, no one was like, I'm better or worse, right? Unless it had to do with, they knew the city better, they paid more, got more fares than you. But beyond that, but I run into this thing because most of the people I know, except basically my coffee shop friends, my kind of like people that are sort of similar to me. But outside of that, my friends, they're almost to a one. They're all college educated. Most of them make good money. And the ones that are close, they know who I am, and this is not an issue. But acquaintances and people I meet here and there, and when I did do those driving jobs, I just could not stand, there's a type of person that will talk to you in your job that's not that, great. They'll sense that you are knowledgeable or articulate or whatever, or somewhat educated. And they're basically saying, well, why the fuck don't you have a better job? They don't put it that way, but it's clearly what they're saying. So, anyway, the way you phrased it or put it, James, I think is sort of what I've experienced. But I do also, I mean, there have been times when I thought I got to just move to a different city. I feel out of place here. But I don't feel that way now. I just, I'm old enough. I've kind of just, I figured a lot of shit out. But those are things I've gone through here. I don't know. And Lee says, I guess I bludgeon people into silence.
Well, Nate, can you do that Wyoming accent for us?
I cannot. It's not that pronounced. I can barely hear it.
Wyoming. What is it?
I really don't know.
Oh, I'm going to have to do some research and, find an AI Wyoming voice.
I mean, I've got a Wisconsin accent. I can barely hear it. And Lee said I sound like Walter Cronkite once.
No, not true.
That's the way it is.
You're all going on about this class business, but there's a difference between internalizing the idea that you belong to a class and accepting judgment about class and just sort of I don't know if it's ignoring other people's judgments What?
Yeah. I mean, when I said I've aged and handled things better, that's what I mean. I care less and less and less about other people's judgments. Thank God.
Well, I mean, of just my experience, well, maybe I'm lying. I don't know. But I don't think class was ever a conscious thing most of the time to me. I mean, I more had felt a differentiation with managers as opposed to other people. I hate managers.
Ah,
This
But
is
they're
why
not
we
What?
this is why we get along most of the time.
as a
Yeah,
member of the
but
professional managerial class, I welcome your hatred.
yeah, the thing about managers is managers aren't necessarily of an economic class, one or
No.
another economic class. They're just a certain personality type very often, and just being called a manager can change your mentality.
Well, what you
Mhm.
just said, Nancy, I realized that too at some point. And that actually made me feel guilty for the grief I used to give managers in my early 20s. Because I realized they're barely different than me. Barely. And
Yeah.
I somehow thought that they, were these masters of, they were these oppressors.
They
But their
are.
situation was barely different than mine.
Yeah, well, they're self-selected. Apparently, this is still beaming to whatever the general whatever. So I was going to call them a nasty word.
We're still reaching our listener.
They gave me grief. I didn't give them grief. They
Well,
gave
what did they
me
give you
grief.
grief about?
Anything they wanted to. They just decided that to hate some certain people, mostly me, but anyway.
Ah,
Oh,
If you're not manageable, managers don't like you. That's all there is to it.
well,
yeah,
that's true.
you don't respect the authority. What?
No,
Oh,
you think you might have an idea.
Yeah,
Just shut up.
yeah,
You're
yeah.
not an idea person. You're
Well, that's
a
why I became
low.
a
That's
union.
well, that's bad management. I'm sorry. That's not a good.
no, that's true. Yeah, I think James, that's right. So, yeah,
I
absolutely.
was a
Most
manager. I mean,
management is bad management.
It is,
It's
yeah.
not as if people are a genius at management, so they're automatically managers. That's not how it
Yeah.
works at all. Because in
No, but
any field,
they're
let me just finish. In any field, by definition, almost everyone is mediocre,
I have met
including
a
management.
few I have met a few really good managers, Nancy.
Me too.
Yeah. Yeah, okay.
I was a good manager once upon a time when I worked at Quick Spring Design, this design firm, and I had to manage other people and manage a team but that whole job was very much project focused. So it wasn't like working in a grocery store or something where it's basically just the same thing over and over again. It was very much, all right, this is the project, these are the roles, these are the, build the schedule and stay on the schedule.
You are
And
working in the arts.
But here you're telling us you were a good manager, but what might, I mean, maybe your underlings would say so too, but
Yeah,
that's who
yeah.
you have to really find out
Oh,
from.
James, remember him? He
We
was all right.
cannot,
Well,
We
and that
cannot
was
take your assessment of
no, you
yourself.
cannot take my assessment.
No.
And that's why they did every 4 times a year or twice we did our, we had to do our assessments. The what are they called? Performance reviews.
Evaluation.
Evaluation.
Evaluation. I hate that too.
Yeah.
Managers and evaluations.
I had to evaluate them,
bad
and then
things.
people evaluated me. Well, the boss evaluated me.
The boss.
How did
I
the
hate the
Gantt chart
boss
look?
too.
We're getting into
What?
politics now.
But listen, I did have a great supervisor at the botanical gardens. A
Oh,
really,
see, there you
a
go.
person. Yes, no, it's not. She was exceptional because you wanted to make her job easier. You wanted to do a good job for that person. That's good management, and it's
Yes.
rare.
And you want to take, as a manager, you want to take advantage of educational opportunities to teach. Because I didn't think of myself as a manager. I thought of myself as a part-time teacher.
Mm-hmm. Yep. Yep. Both of those things. Absolutely.
But I don't miss it. I
I
never
had
want to do
one
that
manager
again.
who was so bad when he received post. The name is usually an insult from the customer. It'd be like the Muppet Signco or the Dickhead Signco. There's one for Alan. There's another one for Alan. We all knew who he was. Alan, you've got post. What does it say? Wanker. All right. That's for me.
Wanker. Nice. You're the wanker.
He was a complete dick. But that was a small company, and it gone from two managers.
It's better to be a complete dick than only a half a dick.
Well, depends. It's not the size that counts, it's what you do with it.
Well, I guess it's hard to do much with only half a dick.
I guess something going back to the kind of more narrow discussion of class categories. It occurs to me because when you guys are talking about Connecticut, it just suddenly dawned on me, part of the thing is for me, living in